Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we delve into the most spine-chilling and mysterious tales from around the world. Tonight, we uncover the dark side of Thanksgiving, a holiday known for warmth and gratitude, but also shrouded in eerie and unexplained events. From uninvited guests to cursed turkey dinners, these 7 terrifying stories will make you think twice about your next holiday meal. Dim the lights, settle in, and prepare for a feast of fear. Story number 1. I still remember that Thanksgiving as if it were yesterday, the year we forgot about Grandma's silver fork. Our family has lived in the same old farmhouse in rural Texas for generations. The house creaks with the weight of memories, its walls adorned with faded photographs and heirlooms passed down through the years. But none was more cherished than Grandma's silver fork. Grandma May was the matriarch of our family, a stern yet loving woman who held us all together. When she passed away, we inherited her silverware set, but the fork was special. It was the one she used every Thanksgiving. A simple piece of silver with an intricate floral pattern on the handle, worn smooth by decades of use. Every year since her passing, we'd place it at the head of the table in her honor, a silent acknowledgement that she was still with us in spirit. That year, however, was different. The family had grown apart in subtle ways. My brother Jack had moved to Houston for work, and my sister Laura was juggling college applications and a part-time job. Mom and Dad seemed more preoccupied than ever, caught up in their own worries. The farmhouse felt emptier, the echoes of laughter and shared stories fading into the past. Thanksgiving Day arrived with overcast skies and a biting chill in the air, a rarity in our parts. We bustled around the kitchen, preparing the feast. The scent of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the house. But there was a tension underlying the usual festivities. Arguments sparked over trivial matters. The seasoning of the stuffing, the placement of the centerpieces, even the choice of tablecloth. In the chaos, we set the table hastily. Plates clattered, glasses were filled, and the dishes were laid out in a haphazard spread. We took our seats, murmuring a quick grace before digging in. It wasn't until halfway through the meal that I realized something was off. Does anyone feel like we're forgetting something? I asked, glancing around the table. Mom looked up from her plate, a crease forming between her brows. What do you mean, dear? I don't know. It's just different this year. Laura rolled her eyes. Everything's fine. Can we just eat? I let it go, but an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. After dinner, we retreated to our separate corners of the house. Jack was glued to his phone. Laura disappeared into her room, and Mom and Dad busied themselves with cleaning up. I wandered into the living room, where Grandma's portrait hung above the fireplace. Her eyes seemed to follow me, a hint of disappointment in her gaze. That's when it hit me, the fork. We had forgotten to place Grandma's silver fork at the table. I rushed back to the dining room, searching through the drawers where we kept the silverware. I rifled through the tarnished knives and spoons, but the fork was nowhere to be found. Mom, I called out, trying to keep the panic from my voice. She appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. What is it? Grandma's fork. It's missing. She frowned. Are you sure? Maybe it's in the dishwasher. We searched the kitchen, the dining room, even the storage boxes in the attic. But the fork had vanished. It's just a fork, Laura said when we told her. Why are you making such a big deal? It's Grandma's fork. I insisted. We always put it out for Thanksgiving. Jack shrugged. We forgot this year. No biggie. But it felt like a big deal. Felt wrong. That night, couldn't sleep. A restless energy buzzed in the air, and the house seemed to groan with each gust of wind outside. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint clinking sound coming from downstairs. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound was irregular, like metal tapping against wood. Gathering my courage, I slipped out of bed and crept toward the staircase. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon casting pale shadows through the windows. As I descended the stairs, The clinking grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the dining room. "Hello," I called out softly, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I pushed open the dining room door, and the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The table was set again, but this time only one place, the head of the table where Grandma's fork should have been. And there, lying neatly on the napkin, was the silver fork. I let out a shaky breath, relief mingling with confusion. "How did you get here?" I murmured, stepping forward. As I reached for the fork, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath puffed out in white clouds, and a prickling sensation crawled up my spine. Then, I saw it, the fork was stained, dark. Rusty splotches marred the gleaming silver. I hesitated, then touched a finger to the stain. It was tacky and left a crimson smear on my skin. Blood. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Silence. I grabbed the fork, wrapped it in the napkin, and backed out of the room. As I turned to head upstairs, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping across the far wall. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I showed the fork to my family. They stared at the dried blood in disbelief. "This is some kind of joke, right?" Jack asked, his face pale. "Who would do this?" Mom whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. Dad examined the fork, his expression grim. "We need to put it back where it belongs." We cleaned the fork carefully, scrubbing away the blood until it shone like new. At dinner that evening, we placed it at the head of the table, just as we always had. But the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Shadows seemed deeper, sounds more ominous. Doors creaked open on their own, and cold drafts chilled us even when the windows were closed. Over the next few days, strange occurrences became the norm. Objects moved on their own, picture frames turned face down, candles extinguished without a breeze. At night, I heard whispers echoing through the halls, unintelligible but filled with a palpable sense of anger. One evening, as we gathered in the living room, the lights flickered and went out. We sat in darkness, the only illumination coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. "Enough is enough," Dad declared. "We need to figure out what's going on." "It's Grandma," I said softly. They all looked at me. "She's upset that we forgot about her fork. We broke the tradition." Laura scoffed. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I shot back. "Look around. Ever since that night, things have been wrong." Mom rubbed her temples. "Maybe we should hold a memorial, or say a prayer, something to honor her." Dad nodded slowly. "It's worth a try." We gathered around the table, the fork placed prominently before us. Dad led us in a heartfelt prayer, apologizing for our neglect and asking for Grandma's forgiveness. As we finished, a warmth spread through the room. The oppressive weight that had settled over the house seemed to lift, and for the first time in days, I felt at ease. That night, I slept soundly, and when I awoke, the sun was shining brightly. The house felt lighter, as if a dark cloud had passed. From then on, we never forgot to place Grandma's silver fork at the table during Thanksgiving or any family gathering. For that matter, the strange occurrences ceased, and life returned to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly avoided something far worse. Years later, after Mom and Dad had passed and the farmhouse became mine, I found myself preparing for another Thanksgiving. My own children ran through the halls, their laughter echoing off the walls. As I set the table, I unwrapped Grandma's fork and placed it at the head. My daughter, Emily, watched me curiously. "Why do we always put that old fork there?" she asked. I smiled gently. "It's a family tradition. It reminds us of Grandma May." She considered this. "Can I sit there?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." That evening, as we sat down to dinner, I felt a sense of contentment. The family was together. The house was filled with warmth, and Grandma's fork was right where it belonged. But as the meal progressed, I noticed Emily picking at her food. "Everything okay?" I asked. She looked up, her eyes wide. "I thought I saw someone standing in the hallway. Probably just a shadow," I assured her. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door. I sat up, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving down the hall toward the stairs. I got up and quietly opened the door. The hallway was empty, but I could still hear the faint sound of footsteps descending the staircase. I followed cautiously. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw a figure standing by the dining room entrance, a woman in a long dress, her back to me. "Grandma," I whispered. She turned slowly, and I caught a glimpse of her face, pale and expressionless, eyes dark as shadows. She raised a finger to her lips, signaling silence, then pointed toward the dining room table. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. The table was set as we had left it, but Grandma's fork was missing. I looked back to where the figure had stood, but she was gone. In the morning, I found the fork on the kitchen counter, stained with fresh blood. I knew then that the tradition was more than a simple act of remembrance. It was a pact, a binding agreement that kept something at bay. I gathered my family and told them the story, the real story, of Grandma's fork and the events of that Thanksgiving long ago. "We must never forget," I told them. "This isn't just about honoring Grandma. It's about keeping our family safe." They listened with a mixture of disbelief and fear, but they agreed to uphold the tradition. And so, every year, we place the fork at the head of the table. We make sure to honor Grandma May, to keep her memory alive. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the footsteps. I still feel the chill in the air. And I wonder if forgetting the fork was just an accident, or if it was a warning. Because some traditions aren't just about the past. They're about protecting the future, and some spirits aren't ready to let go. Story number 2. I still can't shake the memory of that Thanksgiving in 1970. Our family home in rural Pennsylvania was alive with the warmth of gathered relatives, the aroma of roasted turkey filling every corner. The old farmhouse creaked with familiar sounds, the laughter of cousins, the clinking of dishes, and the soft hum of conversation, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-dusted fields. We prepared to sit down for the feast. Grandma Margaret insisted on using the heirloom silverware, and Uncle Frank was already sneaking bites of stuffing when he thought no one was looking. Just as we were about to take our seats around the extended dining table, the doorbell rang. It was unusual. We weren't expecting anyone else. My father exchanged a puzzled glance with my mother before getting up to answer. From my spot, I could see the front door open to reveal a well-dressed man in a neatly pressed suit, a fedora hat in his gloved hands. He had a warm smile and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of stories. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "I hope I'm not intruding. I'm a friend of the family, an old acquaintance of Frank's. I was passing through and thought I'd stop by to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving." Uncle Frank stepped forward, squinting as if trying to place him. "Well, I'll be. It's been ages," he exclaimed, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. My father hesitated for just a moment before his ingrained hospitality took over. "Please, come in. You're more than welcome to join us for dinner." The stranger nodded appreciatively and stepped inside, his presence commanding yet unobtrusive. As he removed his overcoat, I noticed he carried himself with a certain elegance, almost as if he belonged to another era. Introductions were made, though I couldn't quite catch his name over the clamor of everyone settling in. He was seated across from me, between Grandma Margaret and my sister Emily. Throughout the meal, he engaged each person with ease, recalling shared memories and asking thoughtful questions. It was as if he'd known us all his life. "These mashed potatoes are exceptional," he complimented my mother, who blushed at the praise. "Family recipe." She smiled. He turned to me next. "And you must be Michael. Last time I saw you, you were barely tall enough to reach the cookie jar." I chuckled politely. though I was certain we'd never met. Time flies, I guess. As the evening progressed, any initial awkwardness dissolved. Stories flowed freely. Laughter echoed off the wooden beams, and the stranger blended seamlessly into our family tapestry. Yet, an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite identify lingered. A slight disconnect, like a word on the tip of your tongue. After dessert, my mother suggested we take a family photo, a tradition she'd upheld every Thanksgiving since I could remember. We gathered in the living room, arranging ourselves around the grand stone fireplace. The stranger stood off to the side, watching with a gentle smile. "Please, join us," my mother insisted. He raised a hand modestly. "Oh, I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Uncle Frank added, clapping him on the back. "You're practically family." He nodded graciously and positioned himself between Grandma Margaret and me. The old Polaroid camera flashed, capturing the moment in a bright burst of light. As the evening wound down, the stranger thanked us for our hospitality. "It's been a true pleasure," he said warmly. "I should be on my way. Do you have a place to stay tonight?" my father asked. "I'll be just fine," he assured us, donning his hat and coat. With a final nod, he stepped out into the chilly night. It wasn't until after he left that the questions began to surface. "Frank, how exactly do you know him?" Aunt Clara asked, pouring herself another cup of coffee. Uncle Frank paused, a puzzled expression crossing his face. "You know, I thought he was a friend of yours." A silence settled over the room as we exchanged confused glances. "He said he knew you," my father said slowly. "No, he mentioned being acquainted with Grandma," Emily added. Grandma Margaret looked up, her brow furrowed. "I don't recall ever meeting that gentleman before tonight." A sense of unease crept into the atmosphere. "Well, perhaps he's an old neighbor or a distant relative," my mother suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Maybe the photo will jog our memories," I offered, retrieving the Polaroid from the mantel where it had been placed to develop. Gathering around, we waited as the image slowly materialized. Faces came into focus, smiling, familiar, but something was off. The stranger wasn't there. "That's odd," Uncle Frank muttered. "He was standing right next to you. Michael, maybe he stepped away before the picture was taken," my mother suggested, but we all knew he hadn't. I ran my finger over the glossy surface where he should have been. The space was empty, a gap in the lineup that made the image feel incomplete. "Must be a faulty film," my father reasoned, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. That night, sleep eluded me. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. Who was that man? Why did none of us truly know him, yet felt compelled to welcome him so openly? The next morning, I decided to do some digging, starting in the attic. I sifted through old photo albums and boxes of memorabilia, searching for any clue about our mysterious guest. Dust particles floated in the slivers of sunlight as I flipped through yellowed pages. Then I saw it, a black and white photograph dated 1935. It was a family portrait taken in front of this very house. There, standing beside a much younger Grandma Margaret, was a man who looked exactly like our stranger. Same piercing eyes, same confident posture, heart pounding. I brought the photo downstairs. "Grandma, who is this?" She adjusted her glasses, leaning in, her face pale. That's Richard, my older brother," she whispered. "He died in a car accident when he was 25. Cold knot formed in my stomach. That can't be. He was here last night." She shook her head emphatically. "That's impossible. Richard passed away long before you were born." Word spread quickly among the family. The more we discussed it, the more unsettling it became. Each of us had a different recollection of who the stranger claimed to be, as if he'd tailored his identity to each individual. Uncle Frank swore he talked about serving in the war together, though Uncle Frank had been exempt from service due to a medical condition. Emily remembered him mentioning shared classes at a university she never attended. We examined the Polaroid again, hoping for some rational explanation. Instead, we noticed something else, a shadowy blur where the stranger should have been, as if the camera had tried to capture him but failed. Maybe it's a trick of the light, my mother suggested weakly, or perhaps we all just imagined him, my father added, though we knew that wasn't true. Over the following days, strange occurrences began to plague the house. Objects moved from their usual places. Footsteps echoed in empty rooms. The scent of old cologne, faint but unmistakable, lingered in the hallways. One evening, as I was heading to bed, I heard muffled voices coming from the living room. Peering around the corner, I saw Grandma Margaret sitting in her favorite armchair, speaking softly. "Grandma? Who are you talking to?" She looked up, startled. "Oh, just reminiscing." I glanced at the empty chair opposite her. The cushion bore the impression of someone having sat there recently. The air was cooler, a slight draft that raised the hairs on my arms. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked cautiously. She smiled faintly. "Just tired, dear. It's been a long day." That night, a vivid dream pulled me into its grasp. I stood in the middle of our dining room, the table set as it had been on Thanksgiving. The stranger sat alone at the head, his eyes fixed on me. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice echoing unnaturally. He leaned forward, shadows obscuring half his face. "To remember," he replied cryptically. "Remember what?" "Everything that's been forgotten." I woke with a start, his words ringing in my ears. The next morning, I found Grandma Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, a pile of old letters before her. "These arrived shortly after Richard died," she said softly, not looking up. I never had the heart to open them. "May I?" I asked gently. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Carefully, I unfolded the brittle paper of the first letter. It was from Richard, dated a week before his death. "Dear family, I hope this letter finds you well. There's much I need to tell you when I return home. I've made mistakes, ones I hope can be forgiven. Please know that everything I've done was with the intention of protecting our family's legacy. I'll explain everything soon. All my love, Richard." A chill settled over me. "He wanted to tell you something important." Grandma Margaret sighed heavily. "He left abruptly years before, after a falling out with our father. No one knew why. When we heard of his accident, it was too late. Maybe he's trying to communicate," I suggested, "to find closure." She met my gaze, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "What can we do?" That evening, we gathered around the fireplace, the family subdued. We shared stories of Richard, what little we knew, and read his letters aloud. It was a somber affair, tinged with regret and longing. As we finished, a gentle warmth seemed to envelop the room. The lights flickered softly, and the scent of that old cologne filled the air once more. "I think he's here," Emily whispered. Grandma Margaret smiled through her tears. "Thank you, Richard." In the days that followed, the unsettling events ceased. The house felt lighter, as if a lingering shadow had finally passed. We developed the rest of the photos from Thanksgiving, and in each one, the stranger was absent, but the inexplicable blur remained, a subtle reminder of his presence. Life returned to normal, but the experience left an indelible mark on all of us. We became closer, more appreciative of the time we shared. Grandma Margaret often spoke of Richard afterward, ensuring his memory lived on. Years later, as I recount this story to my own children, I wonder about the thin veil that separates us from the beyond. Perhaps, sometimes, those who have passed reach out not to haunt us, but to heal old wounds and reconnect the threads of family that time has frayed. Every Thanksgiving since, we set an extra place at the table, a silent tribute to the uninvited guest who reminded us of the importance of forgiveness, understanding, and the enduring bonds of family. And sometimes, just when the house is quiet and the last embers of the fireplace glow softly, I catch a fleeting scent of cologne and feel a gentle presence nearby. It's in those moments I whisper into the stillness. "Thank you, Richard. You're always welcome here." Story number 3. I can still remember the dim glow of the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement as I hurried down Fifth Avenue. It was Thanksgiving Eve, 1995, and New York City pulsed with a frenetic energy that only the holidays could bring. I had just landed a new job at a prestigious law firm and decided to treat myself to a celebratory dinner at La Fontaine, one of the city's most renowned restaurants. La Fontaine was the kind of place where the clink of crystal glasses mingled with soft jazz, where patrons spoke in hushed tones over candlelit tables. The maitre d' greeted me with a warm smile, taking my coat and leading me to a cozy table near the large window overlooking the bustling street below. As I perused the menu, a waiter appeared at my side, a tall, slender man with dark hair neatly slicked back, dressed impeccably in a crisp white shirt and black vest. "Good evening, sir," he said with a slight bow. "May I start you off with something to drink?" "I'll have a glass of your finest red," I replied. "Excellent choice." He nodded, before gliding away silently. The meal progressed smoothly. The wine was exquisite, the filet mignon cooked to perfection. As I savored each bite, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment wash over me. Life, it seemed, was finally aligning in my favor. It was then that I noticed him, the waiter moving through the kitchen doorway visible from my seat. Except this wasn't the same waiter who had served me earlier. This man was different. He moved with a mechanical precision, back and forth, always carrying a silver tray laden with dishes. His path never varied, and oddly, he never emerged from the kitchen into the dining area. Curiosity piqued. I watched him for several minutes. He was relentless in his motions, never pausing, never interacting with the other staff. Something about him unsettled me, the rigidity of his posture, the emptiness in his gaze. "Excuse me," I called out to my waiter as he passed by. "Who is that man in the kitchen?" The waiter glanced over his shoulder. "Which man?" "Sir, the one carrying the tray, moving back and forth. He hasn't stopped since I sat down." The waiter frowned. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's no one fitting that description in our staff." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "But I've been watching him this whole time." He offered a polite but strained smile. "Perhaps it's a reflection or a shadow, sir. Can I get you anything else?" I shook my head, my appetite fading. "No, thank you." As the waiter walked away, I turned my attention back to the kitchen. The man was still there, his relentless pacing unbroken, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. I decided to approach the kitchen myself. I weaved through the elegantly set tables, the soft murmur of conversations fading as I neared the kitchen door. Pushing it open, I was greeted by a burst of heat and the savory aroma of gourmet dishes being prepared. Chefs in white coats moved about efficiently, but none seemed to notice my intrusion. Then I saw him up close, the waiter. He was even more unsettling in proximity. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, which stared straight ahead. Unseeing, he continued his march, stepping around bustling cooks as if they weren't there. "Excuse me," I called out tentatively. No reaction. I reached out to tap his shoulder, but a firm hand grabbed my arm. "Sir, customers aren't allowed in the kitchen," a stern voice declared. I turned to see the maitre d' glaring at me. I was just, I stammered, glancing back to where the waiter had been. He was gone. "This area is for staff only," he reiterated, guiding me back to the dining room. "Please return to your seat." Embarrassed, I complied, back at my table. I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. Who was that man? Why did no one acknowledge his presence? I decided to let it go. Perhaps the stress of the new job and the wine had gotten to me. I settled the bill and prepared to leave. As I waited for my coat at the entrance, an older woman standing next to me struck up a conversation. "Beautiful place. isn't it? She mused. Yes, quite, I agreed, forcing a smile. You look like you've seen a ghost, she remarked, eyeing me curiously. I chuckled nervously. Just a long day. She leaned in slightly. You saw him, didn't you? My breath caught. I'm sorry. The waiter, she whispered, tall, pale, moves without a sound. I stared at her, words failing me. I've been coming here for years, she continued softly, and every time I see him, but no one else ever does. Who is he? I managed to ask. She glanced around before answering. Some say he's the spirit of a chef who worked here decades ago. They say he took his own life in the kitchen after a tragic accident. Before I could respond, the maitre d' returned with our coats. The woman gave me a knowing look before disappearing into the night. That night, sleep was elusive. My mind churned with thoughts of the spectral waiter and the woman's cryptic words. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to do some research. The next day, I delved into the city's archives, scouring old newspapers and records. It took hours, but finally, I found an article from 1970, Tragedy at La Fontaine. Renowned chef found dead in apparent suicide. According to the report, a chef named Victor Moreau had taken his own life in the restaurant's kitchen after a sous chef was severely burned due to his negligence. Consumed by guilt, Victor had hung himself the following night. A photograph accompanied the article. My blood ran cold as I recognized the face. It was the waiter I'd seen. Armed with this information, I returned to La Fontaine that evening. The atmosphere was just as refined, but now carried an undercurrent of something darker. I requested a seat near the kitchen once more. As I waited, I kept a vigilant eye on the doorway. Minutes passed, and then I saw him, the same spectral figure, repeating his endless circuit. Summoning my courage, I approached my waiter. Tell me about Victor Moreau, I said plainly. The color drained from his face. Where did you hear that name? I have my sources, I replied. I know he died here. I believe he's still here. He glanced around nervously before leaning in. Sir, please keep your voice down. Management doesn't like us discussing him. Why not? People have a right to know if the place is haunted. He sighed heavily. Look, ever since I started working here, there have been occurrences, unexplained sights, sounds. We try to ignore them. It's easier that way. Doesn't it bother you? Of course it does, he admitted. But this job pays well, and we all have bills to pay. Has anyone tried to communicate with him? To help him move on? He shook his head. We wouldn't even know where to start. An idea formed in my mind, a risky, possibly foolish idea. What if I tried? He looked at me skeptically. And how do you propose to do that? Let me stay after closing. I want to speak with him. He hesitated. I could lose my job. I'll make it worth your while, I assured him, slipping a folded bill into his hand. He glanced at the amount and nodded reluctantly. Fine, be back here at midnight. That night, I returned to a darkened La Fontaine. The waiter met me at the back entrance, ushering me inside quickly. You have 1 hour, he whispered. Then you need to leave. I made my way to the kitchen, which was eerily silent. Stainless steel surfaces glinted under the dim emergency lights. The air was thick with the lingering scent of spices and something else, a hint of decay. Victor, I called out softly. My name is Daniel. I just want to talk. Silence. I stepped further in, the tiles cold beneath my feet. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision. I'm sorry for what happened to you, I continued. I read about the accident. It wasn't your fault. A faint clattering echoed from the pantry. I moved toward the sound, heart pounding. Victor, please, let me help you. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, extinguishing the small flashlight I carried. Darkness enveloped me. I fumbled with the switch, but it wouldn't turn back on. Then, a voice, hoarse and barely audible. Can't leave. Why can't you leave? I asked, straining to pinpoint the source. Trapped by guilt. Victor, the accident wasn't your fault. You don't have to stay here. A shadow materialized ahead, a vague silhouette of a man. His features were indistinct, but I could feel his anguish. They won't forgive me, he whispered. Who won't forgive you? The ones I hurt. I realized he wasn't just speaking of the sous chef, but perhaps others, people who had suffered because of him. Let me help you find peace, I offered. Tell me how. The temperature dropped further, my breath visible in the dim light. Too late, he rasped. Suddenly, the kitchen erupted into chaos. Pots and pans clanged violently. Utensils flew across the room. Shattering glass echoed as dishes crashed to the floor. I ducked, shielding myself from the onslaught. Victor, stop! An overwhelming pressure bore down on me, as if the very air were pushing me out. Leave, now, the disembodied voice commanded. Realizing I was in over my head, I stumbled toward the exit. As I reached the door, I cast one last glance back. The shadowy figure stood amidst the wreckage, a sorrowful presence fading into the darkness. I fled into the night, my mind reeling. The next day, I returned to find the restaurant closed. A sign on the door citing unexpected maintenance. I knew the truth. I sought out the waiter, but he was nowhere to be found. One of the staff informed me he'd quit that morning. Did he say why? I asked. She shook her head. Just left a note saying he couldn't stay any longer. I left La Fontaine, the weight of failure heavy upon me. I had tried to help, but perhaps some souls are beyond saving. Weeks later, I read a small article buried in the local newspaper. Historic restaurant closes doors amid financial struggles. La Fontaine had shut down permanently. Rumors swirled about the real reason. Some cited mismanagement. Others whispered of hauntings. I couldn't help but feel responsible, wondering if my actions had unsettled whatever fragile balance existed. Years passed, and life moved on, but the memory lingered. Occasionally, I'd walk past the now abandoned building, its windows boarded up, the once grand facade fading. One evening, curiosity drew me inside. The door was unlocked, the interior cloaked in shadows. Dust coated every surface, and the air was stale. As I stood in the silent dining room, a faint sound reached my ears, the soft clinking of dishes. I followed it to the kitchen doorway, peering into the darkness. There he was, the spectral waiter, continuing his endless journey, trapped in a loop of despair. I realized then that some echoes of the past persist, bound by emotions too strong to fade. Perhaps Victor remained not out of guilt alone, but as a guardian, tethered to the place where his life had unraveled. Leaving the building, I felt a strange sense of closure. Not every story ends neatly, and not every spirit seeks release. Sometimes, all we can do is remember. So if you ever find yourself in a dimly lit restaurant and catch a glimpse of someone who doesn't quite belong, moving silently, eyes distant, pay attention. You may be witnessing a fragment of history, a soul lingering just beyond our reach. And perhaps, in acknowledging them, we offer the smallest measure of peace. Story number 4. I can still recall the Thanksgiving of 1975 with a clarity that haunts me to this day. Our family farmhouse sat nestled among the rolling hills of rural Maine, surrounded by sprawling fields and dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was crisp that November, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow. My parents prided themselves on tradition. Every year, we raised our own turkey for the Thanksgiving feast. But that year had been hard on the livestock. Disease had swept through the poultry, leaving us without the centerpiece for our holiday meal. 2 days before Thanksgiving, a traveling salesman happened upon our farm. He was an odd-looking man, tall and gaunt, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to look right through you. He drove a beat-up truck with a canvas-covered bed, filled with all manner of goods. "Turkey for sale," he called out in a voice that carried over the cold wind. My father, ever the practical man, saw an opportunity. "We could use a bird," he muttered, approaching the stranger. The salesman pulled back the canvas to reveal a single turkey, plump and motionless. Its feathers were an unusual shade of dark brown, almost black, and it seemed larger than any turkey I'd ever seen. "Freshly killed this morning," the salesman assured us, his thin lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. My mother hesitated. "I don't know, John. There's something off about it." "Nonsense," my father replied. "It's perfect." Money exchanged hands, and the salesman tipped his hat before driving off down the dusty road, disappearing into the line of bare trees. Back inside, we placed the turkey on the kitchen counter. I remember feeling a slight unease as I looked at it. Its eyes were closed, but it almost seemed as if it were merely sleeping. "Help me pluck the feathers," my mother instructed, handing me a pair of gloves. As we worked, the atmosphere in the kitchen grew heavy. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and causing the old house to creak. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the flickering flames of the fireplace. "Did you see that?" my younger sister, Lily, whispered. "See what?" I asked. She pointed at the turkey. "I thought I saw it move," I scoffed. "It's just your imagination." But deep down, I felt it too, a subtle twitch, a barely perceptible shudder beneath my fingers. Dinner preparations continued, and soon the unsettling moment was forgotten amid the clatter of pots and the aroma of baking pies. By evening, the turkey was cleaned and ready to be seasoned. That night, I was jolted awake by a sound, a low, muffled noise that resonated through the floorboards. It was a sort of groan, unlike anything I'd heard before. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you hear that?" Lily whispered from across the room. Before I could answer, a thud echoed from downstairs, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping along the wooden floor. "Stay here," I instructed, pulling on a sweater and grabbing the flashlight from my bedside table. I crept out into the hallway, the house eerily silent except for the occasional groan of the old timber. The staircase creaked under my weight as I descended, each step deliberate and cautious. Reaching the bottom, I swept the flashlight beam across the darkened living room. Nothing seemed out of place. The kitchen door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows. The turkey lay on the counter where we'd left it, motionless. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. Then, just as I turned to leave, the beam landed on the turkey's head. Its eyes were open. I froze. The eyes stared blankly ahead, glassy but unmistakably open. A chill ran down my spine. Slowly, I approached the counter, leaning in for a closer look. Perhaps the eyelids had merely shifted, a natural occurrence in dead animals. Without warning, the turkey's head jerked toward me. I stumbled back, a scream catching in my throat. Footsteps pounded down the stairs as my parents rushed into the kitchen. "What's going on?" my father demanded, flipping on the overhead light. "The turkey, it moved," I stammered, pointing at the bird. My mother frowned. "Honey, it's late. You must be overtired." "I'm telling the truth." My father approached the turkey, prodding it with a carving fork. It remained still. "See? Nothing to worry about," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Defeated, I allowed them to usher me back to bed, but sleep eluded me. I lay awake, listening to the house settle, every creak and groan amplified in the silence. The next day passed without incident, and soon it was Thanksgiving morning. The kitchen buzzed with activity as my mother basted the turkey, now stuffed and ready for the oven. "Care to do the honors?" she asked my father, who lifted the heavy pan and slid it into the preheated oven. The day unfolded as usual. Relatives arrived, filling the house with laughter and conversation. For a while, I managed to push the previous night's events from my mind. As the turkey roasted, a strange odor began to permeate the air. It was a sharp, acrid smell that cut through the pleasant aromas of the other dishes. "Is something burning?" Aunt Clara asked, wrinkling her nose. My mother opened the oven door, a cloud of thick, black smoke billowing out. She coughed, waving a hand to clear the air. "That's odd," she murmured. "The turkey shouldn't be burning at this temperature." My father fetched a pair of oven mitts and pulled the pan out. The turkey's skin had turned an unnatural shade of charred black, cracks forming along its surface. "Maybe it's a bad bird," Uncle Robert suggested. "Impossible," my father insisted. "We got it fresh." A sense of unease settled over the room, determined not to let it spoil the holiday. My mother carved off the burnt skin, revealing surprisingly tender meat beneath. "See? It's fine," she assured everyone, though her smile was strained. We gathered around the table, plates filled with the usual trimmings. The turkey sat at the center, an unspoken tension surrounding it. As we began to eat, a low hum resonated through the dining room. The chandelier above flickered, the lights dimming momentarily. "Must be the wind affecting the power lines," my father said, glancing upward. Then, the humming grew louder, a deep, vibrating sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The dishes rattled on the table, glasses clinking together. "What on earth?" Aunt Clara exclaimed. Suddenly, the turkey shuddered. A collective gasp rose from the table as the bird twitched violently, legs kicking out and knocking over the gravy boat. "Get back!" my father shouted, pushing his chair away. We scrambled to our feet, disbelief and terror gripping us. The turkey convulsed, bones cracking as it contorted unnaturally. Its head lifted, the neck twisting to face us. From its open beak came a guttural moan, a sound that was both animal and disturbingly human. "This isn't possible," Uncle Robert whispered, his face pale. The turkey lurched forward, sliding across the table amid the scattering of dishes. Panic erupted as we stumbled over one another in our haste to escape the dining room. "Everyone outside, now!" my father commanded. We spilled onto the front porch, the cold air a stark contrast to the chaos inside. My mother clutched Lily to her chest, eyes wide with fear. "What is happening?" she cried. Before anyone could answer, the windows of the dining room shattered outward, shards of glass raining onto the lawn. The turkey emerged, now grotesquely enlarged, wings spread wide as it hovered above the ground. "Impossible," I muttered, my mind struggling to comprehend the sight. The creature let out a piercing screech, a sound that resonated deep within, stirring an innate dread. Turned its gaze upon us, eyes burning with an otherworldly light. "Get to the car!" my father yelled. We bolted toward the driveway, feet slipping on the frosty ground. The creature gave chase, its movements swift despite its distorted form. Uncle Robert fumbled with his keys, hands shaking uncontrollably. "Come on, come on," he pleaded. The car doors unlocked, and we piled in just as the creature descended upon us, talons scraping against the metal roof. "Drive!" Aunt Clara screamed. The engine roared to life, tires spinning before catching traction. We sped down the gravel road, the farmhouse shrinking in the rearview mirror. Silence filled the car, each of us grappling with the inexplicable horror we'd witnessed. "Where do we go?" Lily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "The police," my father replied, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. We reached the small town nearby, but our story was met with skepticism. The authorities searched the property but found no sign of the creature. The dining room was untouched, the windows intact, the table set as if awaiting our return. "It was real," I insisted to the sheriff, frustration boiling over. "We all saw it." He offered a sympathetic nod. Stress can play tricks on the mind, especially during the holidays. Defeated, we left, the weight of disbelief heavy upon us. We couldn't return home, not after what happened. In the weeks that followed, we stayed with relatives in another state, News reached us of strange occurrences back at the farmhouse. Livestock disappearing, unnatural sounds echoing in the night. Eventually, my parents sold the property, unwilling to confront whatever evil resided there. Our family never celebrated Thanksgiving again. The holiday became a somber reminder of that night, the unspoken terror that lurked beneath the surface of our memories. We adopted a vegetarian lifestyle, a silent homage to the event that shattered our perception of reality. Years later, I still wonder about the traveling salesman, the glint in his eyes, the knowing smile. Had he known what he was selling us? Was it a cruel joke, curse, or something beyond human understanding? Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I hear echoes of that guttural moan, a haunting reminder that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. If you ever find yourself tempted by an easy solution, a shortcut that seems too good to be true, remember our story. Beware of strangers bearing gifts, and be cautious of the shadows that linger at the edges of the known world. Because sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried, and the dead don't always rest. Story number 5. I can still remember the chill that settled over our small village in Massachusetts that Thanksgiving of 1932. I was just a boy of 12, but the events of that night have stayed with me, etched into my memory like a scar that refuses to fade. Our family was large by today's standards. My parents, my 2 older sisters, my younger brother, and my grandparents all lived under one roof. The Great Depression had hit us hard, but we had each other, and that was enough. That year, the harvest had been bountiful despite the hardships, and Mother had managed to secure a plump turkey for our Thanksgiving meal. The day was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made the hearth's warmth all the more inviting. The aroma of roasted turkey filled the house, mingling with the scent of fresh bread and pumpkin pie. We gathered around the long wooden table, its surface worn smooth by years of family dinners. As we took our seats, a strange tension hung in the air. Father, usually a stickler for tradition, seemed distracted. His brow was furrowed, eyes distant. Mother kept glancing at him, a silent question in her gaze. Grandfather cleared his throat, ready to lead us in the customary grace. But Father raised a hand to stop him. "Not tonight," Father said abruptly. "Let's just eat." We exchanged uneasy glances. Skipping grace was unheard of in our home, but no one dared to question him. Plates were passed. Food was served, but the festive spirit had dimmed. Conversation was sparse, limited to requests for more potatoes or compliments on the pie. After dinner, we retreated to our rooms earlier than usual. The house felt different, colder, despite the roaring fire, and quieter, as if the very walls were holding their breath. I fell asleep to the sound of wind rattling the window panes, a haunting lullaby. Sometime in the night, I awoke to a faint sound, a whisper, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. I sat up, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of hushed voices emanating from downstairs. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my brother, and crept into the hallway. The floorboards groaned softly under my feet as I made my way toward the staircase. The whispers intensified, words just beyond comprehension. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The darkness below seemed thicker, more oppressive. Gathering my courage, I descended one step at a time. As I reached the bottom, a chill washed over me. The kitchen door was ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling into the hall. I peered through the gap. The sight that met my eyes sent a shiver down my spine. The leftover turkey sat on the counter, but something was off. Shadows flickered unnaturally, and the air was filled with a palpable tension. Then I saw them, claw marks etched into the wooden countertops surrounding the turkey, deep gouges that hadn't been there earlier. The whispers swirled around me, growing more insistent. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, resentment, fear rooted me to the spot. I wanted to run, to wake my parents, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, the turkey twitched. First, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it jerked violently, flesh tearing as unseen forces shredded it to pieces. I stumbled back. A scream caught in my throat. The whispers crescendoed into a cacophony, and the kitchen door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. I bolted upstairs, heart pounding, and dove under my covers, trembling until exhaustion pulled me into a restless sleep. The next morning, the family gathered in the kitchen, drawn by Mother's horrified gasp. The turkey was unrecognizable, a mangled mess surrounded by those same claw marks. Father inspected the damage, his face pale. "Must have been a wild animal," he muttered, but we all knew that was impossible. The doors had been locked, windows secured. Grandfather eyed Father suspiciously. "We didn't say grace," he said quietly. Father scowled. "Don't start with that superstitious nonsense." But Grandmother nodded solemnly. "There's truth in the old ways. We disrespected tradition." The rest of the day was tense. Father retreated to his study. Mother busied herself with chores, and the rest of us tried to make sense of what had happened. As night fell, an uneasy silence settled over the house. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind seemed amplified. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. They echoed through the halls, seeping under doors. This time, the entire family was awakened. We gathered in the hallway, eyes wide with fear. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied chorus of lament. "We need to make it right," Grandmother said urgently. "We must give thanks." Father scoffed. "This is ridiculous." Just then, a crash sounded from downstairs. Father grabbed a lantern, and we followed him hesitantly. In the parlor, the portrait of our ancestors had fallen from the wall. The glass shattered. Claw marks marred the wallpaper beneath. Mother clutched her rosary. "John, please." Father's facade cracked. He nodded reluctantly. "Fine, let's do it." We gathered in the dining room around the remnants of our Thanksgiving meal. Holding hands, we bowed our heads as Grandfather led us in prayer. As he spoke, the whispers began to fade, replaced by a growing warmth that chased away the chill. When the prayer ended, a sense of peace settled over us. Father looked humbled, his eyes moist. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I let my pride get the better of me." We cleaned up the broken glass and did our best to restore the house to order. That night, we slept undisturbed. Years went by, and the incident became a family legend, a cautionary tale about the importance of gratitude and tradition. But for me, the memory never faded. Even now, as an old man, I can still hear those whispers in my dreams. I often wonder what might have happened if we hadn't heeded the warning, if we had continued to ignore the traditions that bind us to something greater than ourselves. Perhaps the forces at work were beyond our understanding, ancient and unforgiving. One thing is certain. In that small village in Massachusetts, the legend endures. Every Thanksgiving, families gather to give thanks, not just out of tradition, but out of respect for the unknown. Because sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried, and the old stories carry more truth than we care to admit. Decades after that fateful night, I returned to the old family home. It had long been abandoned, the once sturdy walls now succumbing to time and neglect. The village had changed too, modernized in many ways, yet some things remained untouched. I felt compelled to visit, perhaps seeking closure or answers to questions that had haunted me for years. As I wandered through the overgrown yard, memories flooded back, laughter echoing from the porch, the scent of Mother's baking, the warmth of the hearth. Inside, the house was a shell of its former self. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with decay. I walked through the rooms, each step stirring up ghosts of the past. In the dining room, the long wooden table still stood, though warped and weathered. I ran my hand along its surface, fingers tracing the grooves worn into the wood. It was then that I noticed the faint marks, claw marks, barely visible but undeniably there. A chill ran through me. Had they always been so deep, or had time revealed what was once hidden? As dusk settled, shadows stretched across the room. The silence was heavy, oppressive. I knew I should leave, but something held me there, a lingering sense of unfinished business. Suddenly, a familiar whisper brushed against my ear, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, the same unintelligible murmurs from that night so many years ago. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. No response came, but the whispers grew louder, surrounding me like a swarm. Panic seized me. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair that clattered loudly against the floor. "Enough!" I shouted, fear giving way to anger. "What do you want from me?" The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by a profound silence. Then, a single word resonated through the room, spoken in a voice that was both foreign and hauntingly familiar. "Remember." A sudden understanding washed over me. This place, these events, they were a part of me, a part of my family's legacy. The traditions we upheld weren't just rituals. They were connections to those who came before us, to the very essence of who we were. "I remember," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "And I'm grateful." A warmth spread through the room, gentle and soothing. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I left the house that night, the whispers gone but their message clear. Some stories, some traditions, are meant to endure. They remind us of our place in the world, of the respect we owe to forces beyond our comprehension. Back in the village, I shared my experiences with the locals. Many listened with rapt attention, nodding in understanding. The legend of the Thanksgiving curse was well known, but few had encountered it so directly. From that point on, I made it my mission to honor those traditions, to pass them on to the next generation. Every Thanksgiving, I gather my own family, and we give thanks not out of fear, but out of genuine gratitude, because I've learned that it's not just about avoiding a curse or appeasing spirits. It's about recognizing the threads that connect us all, the importance of humility and acknowledgement, and perhaps, in some quiet corner of that old house, the whispers have finally found rest. Now, as I sit by the fire with my grandchildren at my feet, I tell them the tale of the Thanksgiving when I was 12. Their eyes widen with wonder and a touch of fear, but I assure them it's a story of learning and respect. "Remember," I tell them, "always be grateful for what you have, and honor the traditions that keep us connected." They nod solemnly, and I see in their faces the continuation of a legacy that will outlive me. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind whispers through the trees, I close my eyes and listen, not with fear, but with appreciation, because I know now that the whispers were never meant to harm us. They were reminders, gentle nudges to keep us grounded, to keep us humble, in a world that moves so fast, where it's easy to forget the past. Perhaps we all need a whisper now and then. So this Thanksgiving, when you gather around your table, take a moment to give thanks, not just in words, but in your heart, because you never know who might be listening. Story number 6. I can still recall that Thanksgiving of 1987 as if it were yesterday. The memory clings to me like the lingering scent of smoke after a fire, a constant reminder of events I can't quite explain, yet can't dismiss. Our family home was a modest 2-story house nestled in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, and the changing seasons were marked by the decorations that adorned front lawns. That year, winter had arrived early, blanketing the city in a thin layer of snow that crunched underfoot. Thanksgiving was always a significant event for us. My mother, Margaret, took pride in hosting the family dinner. She believed that the act of gathering around a table, sharing food and stories, was the glue that held our family together. Dad would help with the cooking. My younger sister Emily and I would set the table. And by late afternoon, our relatives would trickle in, bringing with them laughter and the warmth that only family can provide. That evening, the house was filled with the rich aromas of roasted turkey, spiced yams, and freshly baked pies. The dining room glowed softly under the light of the chandelier, its crystal ornaments casting tiny rainbows on the walls. Mother had decided to add a touch of elegance to the dinner that year by incorporating candles into the table setting, tall, slender tapers that she said would add ambience. As we gathered around the table, Mother began lighting the candles. She moved gracefully from one to the next, the tiny flames flickering to life under her careful touch. When she reached the last candle, something unexpected happened. As soon as the match touched the wick, a small flame erupted, not on the candle, but hovering just above it. It was no bigger than a golf ball, a swirling orb of fire that danced and pulsed as if alive. We all stared in stunned silence. "Well, that's unusual," Dad remarked with a nervous chuckle. Mother tried to blow it out, but the flame persisted, swaying gently as if mocking her efforts. Frowning, she waved her hand over it, attempting to snuff it out, but quickly withdrew with a yelp. "It's hot," she exclaimed, cradling her fingers. Concerned, Uncle Robert grabbed a glass of water and poured it over the flame. The water splashed onto the tablecloth, but the flame remained, undiminished and hovering eerily above the now damp candle. "Maybe it's some sort of gas leak," Aunt Susan suggested, her eyes wide. Dad shook his head. "I don't smell any gas. Besides, the candles are brand new." By now, a sense of unease had settled over the room. The flame's glow cast strange shadows on our faces, elongating features and deepening the hollows of our eyes. Emily clutched my arm tightly. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too," I admitted, determined to maintain control. Dad fetched a kitchen towel. "Stand back," he instructed. He threw the towel over the flame, pressing down firmly. For a moment, it seemed to work, but then the towel ignited, flames licking up towards his hands. "Drop it," Mother screamed. He let go, and the burning towel fell onto the table. Plates and glasses scattered as we scrambled to extinguish it. Dad grabbed the fire extinguisher from the kitchen, a bulky red cylinder we'd never had cause to use before. "Everyone back," he ordered, pulling the pin. He aimed and squeezed the handle, releasing a cloud of white foam that engulfed the table. We coughed and waved our hands to clear the air, eyes stinging from the chemicals. When the mist settled, the table was a mess, food ruined, dishes soiled, but the flame remained, floating serenely above the chaos, untouched and unwavering. "This is impossible," Uncle Robert muttered, his face pale. No one knew what to do. We stood there, a circle of bewildered faces illuminated by that unyielding flame. The festive atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. "Maybe we should leave," Aunt Susan suggested, her voice shaky. Mother shook her head. "Leave our home? Because of a trick of the light?" "Margaret, this is no trick," Dad said quietly. "Something's not right." Just then, the lights flickered, the chandelier above us dimmed, and the room plunged into a momentary darkness before the bulbs sputtered back to life. The flame, however, burned brighter, its glow intensifying. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, her eyes filling with tears, before anyone could respond. A sound echoed through the house, a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It was subtle at first, but grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards and into our bones. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum. Mother looked around, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. "I don't know," she admitted. The hum peaked, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The house fell silent. We held our breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then the flame began to move. Slowly, it drifted away from the candle, floating horizontally across the table. We watched in disbelief as it hovered towards the doorway of the dining room. follow it," Dad whispered. "Are you crazy?" Aunt Susan hissed. "We should get out of here." But curiosity, or perhaps some unseen force, compelled us to move, keeping a cautious distance. We trailed the flame as it glided through the house, its light casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. It led us to the living room, where it paused in front of the old fireplace. The hearth hadn't been used in years. Mother preferred the convenience of central heating, but the mantel above was adorned with family photos and heirlooms. The flame hovered before a particular photograph, an old black and white image of a stern-looking man in a military uniform. "That's Grandpa Joseph," Mother whispered. "He died before I was born." As we watched, the flame flickered and then began to rise. Ascending the chimney, we rushed to the window, looking outside to see if we could spot it. But it was gone, vanished into the cold night air. "What on earth was that?" Uncle Robert asked, his voice barely concealing his fear. No one had an answer. That night, after the relatives had left, some hurriedly, without their coats, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Dad suggested it was a gas pocket, an electrical malfunction, anything to rationalize the irrational. But deep down, we all felt it, the lingering presence of something unseen. The house felt different, the air heavier, shadows seemed to stretch a bit longer, and whispers tickled at the edge of hearing. Over the following weeks, small disturbances began to occur. Objects weren't where we'd left them. Lights flickered unpredictably. Doors we were certain we'd closed were found open. One evening, as I was finishing homework in my room, I heard faint music, an old tune that sounded like it came from a gramophone. I followed the sound to the attic, a place we seldom visited. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing dusty trunks and forgotten relics. In the corner stood an antique phonograph, its horn gleaming softly in the dim light. The record spun slowly, the needle gliding along grooves that should have been worn smooth by time. But as I approached, the music faded, and the record came to a stop. I backed away, heart pounding, and nearly tripped over a small box. Inside were letters, yellowed with age, penned in elegant script. They were love letters from Grandpa Joseph to a woman whose name I didn't recognize. "Amelia," I read aloud, startled. I took the letters downstairs to show Mother. She read them with a furrowed brow, eyes misting over. "I never knew about any Amelia," she said softly. "Why would Father keep this a secret?" As we delved deeper, we uncovered a family history shrouded in mystery, a hidden romance, promises broken, and a tragedy that had been buried with time. It became clear that the events, the flame, the disturbances were tied to this forgotten past. It was as if someone, or something, was reaching out, yearning to be acknowledged, determined to find closure. We located Amelia's surviving relatives and learned that she had died in a fire shortly after Grandpa Joseph returned from the war. She had lived alone. Her death ruled accidental, though rumors suggested otherwise. "Maybe she's trying to tell us something," Emily suggested. "Maybe she wants us to know the truth." We decided to hold a small memorial, combining mementos from both families, a gesture of reconciliation for a wrong we didn't fully understand. That night, as we gathered in the living room, the atmosphere felt lighter. We shared stories, lit candles, albeit nervously, and offered a moment of silence for the souls of the past. As the last candle burned low, I felt a gentle warmth beside me, a comforting presence that filled me with peace. The shadows in the room seemed to recede, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt like home again. From that day forward, the disturbances ceased. The lights no longer flickered, objects remained in place, and the whispers faded into memory. But every Thanksgiving, we light a single candle in honor of those who came before us, acknowledging the unseen threads that connect us across time. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and the night is still, I think back to that unquenchable flame. I wonder if it was a warning, a plea, or perhaps a bridge between the living and the departed. I've come to accept that some mysteries aren't meant to be fully solved. They exist to remind us of the vastness of the world beyond our senses. A world where love, loss, and longing endure beyond the confines of mortality. So if you ever find yourself faced with the inexplicable, a flickering light, a whispered name, a fleeting shadow, perhaps it's worth pausing to listen. You never know whose story might be waiting to be told, because sometimes the past isn't as distant as we think, and the spirits of those who came before us linger, hoping not to be forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this unsettling journey through the dark legends of Thanksgiving dinner, from the unquenchable flame in Chicago to the ghostly fork in Texas. These stories remind us that even the most joyful traditions can hide a sinister side. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next dive into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, not all Thanksgiving guests are invited or welcome.